video at some point?
I mean, I don't know. I think, I don't know. We're live. Okay, go ahead, Kristen.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Building Emotional Resilience in an Age of Disasters. I'm Kristen Lombardi, and I'm the editor of Columbia Journalism Investigations, which is the postgraduate reporting program at Columbia Journalism School. Our program employs recent journalism graduates to work on stories of public interest. We partner with professional outlets such as the Center for Public Integrity. This year we teamed up with CPI and 9 other local newsrooms across the country to dig into a topic we think is often overlooked in covering disasters, and that is the mental health consequences of natural disasters. Our investigation published, you likely know, in August. And it was right in the midst of the second wave of the novel coronavirus and right at the very beginning of record-breaking hurricane and wildfire seasons. So we thought it was pretty timely. It really found that this is a country that's ill-prepared for these mounting catastrophes. They are having more and more of an effect on more and more Americans, causing stress and trauma. But the federal response, as it stands, is weak and often serves only a fraction of people who are impacted. We, at the core of this investigation, developed a survey, and I want to thank many of you in the audience because many of you helped us better understand how disasters can linger for people who are impacted by filling out that survey. It was for disaster survivors and mental health professionals. So I just wanted to give a shout out to those of you who participated and filled that out for us. It was very important insights that you offered. Wanted to also just shout out to the 9 local newsrooms that really helped us with this project. They distributed that survey to their readers and their audiences, and they've also written local versions of this investigation for their communities. With this particular event, we thought we would open it up and have a conversation about some of what we found and how people can maybe think about their mental health and solutions, at least at the local level, moving forward, since these disasters are most likely going to keep happening. So I'm going to kick it off to Jamie Smith Hopkins, who's the senior reporter at CPI. She teamed up with CJI fellow Dean Russell to report the main story, and she'll introduce our panelists. Jamie?
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to our panelists. We've got 3 technical difficulties, but we hope to add our 3rd panelist soon. So we'll get started, and let me start by introducing our panelists. First off, Wilton Kelly. He's a community advocate in Port Arthur, Texas. He's also a nationally known environmental justice activist and recipient of the 2011 Goldman Environmental Prize. And very noteworthy for today's discussion, he's a survivor of Hurricane Harvey, which damaged his family's home, and knows intimately what disasters can do to a community. Dr. Annelle Prim is a community psychiatry expert, and she's chair of the All Healers Mental Health Alliance, which is a group that taps volunteers to fill gaps in the government response to disaster-struck communities of color. And then our final panelist, Dr. Irwin Redlener. He's a senior research scholar with Columbia University's National Center for Disaster Preparedness, and he's author of Americans at Risk, Why We're Not Prepared for Mega Disasters and What We Can Do Now. One thing I should mention is that we talked to all 3 as part of our reporting and thought it would really help to have a public discussion with them, that it would help people who are grappling with these issues. So again, I really appreciate you being here, and I'll go ahead and get right to the first question. Audience, just as a reminder, please feel free to start asking questions. They'll pop into a box we can see, and so I will be sprinkling those through our discussion. So first off, it's not surprising that disasters are stressful. I think everybody gets that. But the emotional toll can play out in a variety of ways. And I was hoping that you could speak to some impacts that people should be watching out for in themselves, in their children, and others during and especially in the long aftermath of a disaster. And Dr. Prim, if you could start, that'd be great. Oh, Dr. Prim, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to participate. The sort of things to watch out for after a disaster, disasters cause a great deal of stress. And so they can trigger feelings of anxiety, sadness, especially if people have lost personal belongings, their housing, and even loved ones. So the loss and trauma associated with that is very common in disaster. People may have difficulty sleeping. They may have difficulty with their appetite, may have trouble concentrating. And these things are really natural, stemming from a disaster. But the thing to watch out for is if these things would continue for an extended period of time, that is when it would be time to seek help for them. I think what's so important is after disaster to kind of help restore people's mental health, things like psychological first aid are important to help people maintain their routine. And of course, in order to do that, they need to be reassured, have a sense of calm, a sense of safety, and the realization that there are things that they can do to maintain their routine individually, as well as working with others. We call that self-efficacy and collective efficacy. And of course, staying connected. That's so important to try to guard against some of those stressful feelings and to maintain a sense of hope. But of course, if people have signs of emotional distress that become severe and prolonged, they really should seek help for them. And there are those resources available.
Thank you. And Mr. Kelly, what did you notice, in sort of how you felt, but particularly as time went on? Because I think that may often be the lost piece, that this can take months and months. So as you were dealing with the recovery process, what did you notice in yourself and your family and the rest of the community that you think others should be aware of and be watchful for?
Well stated. My name is Hilton Kelly. I'm the founder and director of the Community Empower and Development Association located on the Gulf Coast. I mean, I'm within, I think within a half a mile of the Gulf of Mexico. So when these storms hit, it's a lot of anxiety that sort of takes place in my mind and in my family's mind. It's a lot of anxiety, depression, because as you all know, the Gulf has been inundated within the last 15 to 20 years with hurricanes. I moved back home from Oakland, California, here to Port Arthur, Texas, and the first storm that I encountered after moving back in 2000 was Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina, as we know, hit New Orleans, and about 2 months after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, where a lot of those folks were evacuated from New Orleans here to the city of Port Arthur. So I saw our town be inundated with people that have been severely impacted by a hurricane. We all seen the images and the video of the victims of Hurricane Katrina in the Superdome. We've seen them in the water. We've seen the bodies floating in the water. We've seen people on top of their homes trapped with no help. We've seen them in the heat fighting for food. We've seen them being marginalized from going across the bridge by other communities with shotguns, telling them not to even try to come over. So here it is, 2 months after Katrina hit, we got hit by Hurricane Rita. And when we got hit by Hurricane Rita, my heart went out to all those thousands of people that were here in Port Arthur that now had to evacuate again. And the stress started to become more personal because we were aiding those folks, but now we were the ones that were being displaced by a storm. And with that, I tried to keep some calm and peace by talking to my wife and telling her that everything was going to be fine, which, I didn't know the potential outcome from Hurricane Rita, but it was devastating to our community. It also damaged our home, but we were able to repair. But when you're away, wondering, what about your property? How is everything going to turn out? Is my house okay? You don't get any information sometime for 2 or 3 weeks. You're wondering if all your possessions are gone. You realize that your food is becoming scarce and people that you with are becoming edgy and irritated with each other. I mean, I've seen whole families fall apart. Wives leave their husbands and husbands leaving their wives, or both of them disagreeing, this is not working, I'm done, because of the economic impact, the stresses of that, and the uncertainty of not knowing where your assistance is going to come from. Even though many times FEMA will come around, maybe 2 or 3 months later after your house is totally rotted, and they offer you maybe a third of what you should be getting to help repair your home. But most time in certain area codes, you only get a portion of what you should be getting because of your political affiliations, predominantly, Democratic. It's a lot of politics that plays into what you receive to help rebuild your life. I want you all to know that. And a lot of times they kind of communicate as to who lives where by your area codes. Your zip codes. So we have to keep that in mind. But yet there are a lot of stressors that bear down on one's mind when it comes to your livelihood, your family support, your own mental ability to help take care of yourself and your family from a male perspective. That weighs heavy, even though we live in a world to where, there's everybody's a leader of the household now. But coming from the South, I still carry that burden of knowing that I'm the man and I should be taking care of my family, my kids, and my grandkids. And that's just the way it is here. And so I was raised that way, but yet it weighs heavy on you. And I've seen it destroy families. I've seen it destroy communities. And as a matter of fact, there are still communities to this date that we can walk through in the city of Port Arthur where people just refuse to return because they couldn't get the help that they needed. And many people have, they've just lost it. You turn to alcohol, you turn to drugs. And it's a really dire situation when your mind starts to play into the fact that this is something that's going to be every year and we have to deal with this, and yet I can't afford to move. Many times you hear people in the media, why don't they just move? Well, it's not that easy. It's not that simple.
Thank you. I wanted to pop in one of the questions from the audience. Those are starting to come in. And this is really good follow-on to what you're seeing, what people should watch out for, which is what can people do to deal with stress? What are some things that you'd recommend? Dr. Prim?
So, there are some things that people can do themselves. One of them is sometimes not to watch too much of the media that plays over and over and over. No offense to you all, of course, but sometimes seeing the disaster play out over and over again can just add to the stress level for people. That is, if they have power, which is often the case that folks don't in the disasters that have been happening recently. But also, trying to restore those normal patterns of sleep and, getting enough food and so forth, that can help. Doing deep breathing exercises and other relaxation techniques. Some people use things like yoga or mindfulness to kind of stay in the moment and not get too far ahead of oneself, which can sometimes increase the level of stress and worry. Staying connected with people in your support system who can comfort you. That's also another way of dealing with stress. But just some of the basics like getting enough rest, eating well, staying hydrated, These are all helpful things to do to reduce stress. Of course, if things get really intense, reaching out for crisis services, like there are disaster helplines that SAMHSA, one of the governmental agencies, provides, and so sometimes that can be helpful to people if some of their own self-care efforts are not doing the job for that. And I think the family can help, especially with children when they are stressed. Kind of talking to them, comforting them if they start having difficulty and maybe kind of regress a little bit in their behavior and their maturation. Being understanding, because the stress from a disaster is real and it affects everyone. And so having that understanding and being patient with each other is really important to help kind of reduce the intensity of the stress that the whole family is feeling.
Thank you. And those are good tips too for any sort of disaster, including COVID-19. So that's important for us all to keep in mind. Mr. Kelly, I want to kind of move one step further from that, which is what are you seeing that are you seeing some things that give you hope? Like, are there success stories that you can point to for the rest of us to learn from? Obviously, you're doing a lot of hands-on work after disasters yourself. So I'm wondering what you think could be a best practice to help people afterward.
Well, what I'm seeing on the ground that sort of gives me hope is the fact that, I've been through this numerous times now, Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Harvey, and Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Gustav, which some of them was a hit and miss. So, I've moved out, come back, moved out, gone, come back so many times. But yet one thing that we have in our corner, the doctor there, her group reached out to me during Hurricane Harvey, and it was very comforting to know that that people cared, that someone was out there thinking about me and my family, and they were very instrumental in assisting us while we were on the road doing Hurricane Harvey. And I just want to say thank you for that. Really
You're so
appreciate
welcome.
you guys' support. It meant a lot to us, actually, and it gave me a sense of calm because I knew that I had someone out there that I can sort of call on or lean on for assistance, providing I needed to help keep my family safe. But what about those folks who don't have that? What about those folks who can't call on anyone? Particularly, usually during these times of disasters, we look to our state and federal governments. But yet, during those disasters, you can't find them, okay? You needed at that moment. You need someone to talk to at that moment. You need to know that you're connected to someone that could potentially aid and assist you immediately in the event that you need that. But yet when you have no one to call, it's very hard to find that quiet space to where you could just calm it down when you're running out of gas on the freeway, or when you're at a hotel but you don't have enough money to pay to get into that hotel because you are an apartment dweller, and now you're not only worried about where you're going to sleep tonight with your 4 kids in the back seat and your husband in tow with the second car and it's running out of gas as well, but now you're wondering also, well, damn, how are we going to get back home? And then when we get back home, will our apartment still be there? How will we replace everything? So all these stressors are weighing on you, but yet there's not a lot that I don't think that anyone can really do, having gone through it, to really calm you after 4 or 5 days of being away from home, knowing that your finances are basically all but gone, and knowing that when you go home, you may or may not have a home. And then if you are a homeowner, that's your stressor. How much will it cost to repair? Will I have to repair the roof? Is the home still there? Or am I going back home to a foundation? And as a renter, you're going back to, wow, I'm about 2 months behind on rent, and I know the electricity may be off and all the food is going to be spoiled. So the hope that I have is the fact that Instead of being reactive, we should be proactive in these events. I mean, I think we've gone through this enough here on the Gulf Coast. We've gone through it enough in the Midwest with tornadoes. We've gone through it enough in California with the wildfires. We've gone through it enough with earthquakes as well. Our government, local, state, and federal, by now should have devised a plan of some sort that can help us to understand how can we be prepared. The same way that we stay at a prepared state for, let's just say, for national security. Well, this is a state of national security, because when you have a people that are somewhat vulnerable to storms, well, those are the same people that fight to protect this country. Those are the same people that serve in the military. Those are the same people that have mothers, sisters, and brothers that live on the Gulf Coast, that live on the West Coast, that live on the East Coast, that they too worry about, even though they're in uniform, fighting somewhere in a war off our lands. So I think it would be behoove of our federal, state, and governments to look at ways in which they can address these issues, because it would give everybody a calm to know that we really have someone that we could call on within our state, within our federal government. It should be a nonpartisan effort, because many times they play politics with what community gets services and what community doesn't. And yet that weighs heavy on our men and women in uniform. I'm 4 years Navy. I was a second-class petty officer when I was honorably discharged from the military, and they wanted me to stay in, but yet I chose to get out after serving 4 years, and it was a good stint. But at the same time, I know what it's like to be away from home, worrying about your loved ones. And I'm sure it's a holistic problem. So I think our government can learn from the numerous storms and fires that we've had to be more proactive instead of reactive.
Thank you. And Dr. Prim, can you talk a little bit about the work that the All Healers group does, and what you see as you work with other individuals and groups, what you've seen on the ground that you think maybe other communities could learn from?
Yes. So the All Healers Mental Health Alliance was formed immediately after Hurricane Katrina. Many of us were in other parts of the country, and we were just heartbroken by what we were seeing and hearing about what was going on there. We couldn't drop everything and go running there like we wanted to, because that wouldn't have been appropriate. We would have just been in the way. So we decided to figure out, how could we assist, and we decided to just come together with a variety of different community leaders, social workers, psychiatrists, nurses, psychologists, faith leaders, and other health advocates to basically brainstorm on ways to facilitate culturally appropriate responses to the mental health needs of people affected by disaster. And so we did all sorts of things over the years. We supported faith leaders in engaging people with mental health needs and provided them with consultation. We utilized very early on telemedicine equipment to help primary care centers connect with people in need who had mental health concerns. And we've intervened in a number of disasters, which, as we all know, have been coming fast and furious over the last 15 years since Hurricane Katrina. I'll give an example of some of the things that we've done. One thing is that we developed a relationship with some people within FEMA, and actually one of our member organization partners had a memorandum of understanding with FEMA, such that when there was a disaster, we would reach out to them to make sure that the communities that we were aware of, communities of color, who were already experiencing pre-existing disparities and sort of chronic smoldering disasters, if you will, even before the hurricanes would hit. And so we knew where the needs were and where the unmet needs were. And as Hilton just said, there were some communities that would get overlooked and bypassed in terms of, getting resources early on, and some of these communities and families were suffering. So we became advocates for them. And as Hilton said, it was important for people to know that somebody cared about them, that they weren't forgotten. And so, for instance, after Superstorm Sandy in New York, we organized a training of health and human service workers on how to respond in a disaster. And we taught them about psychological first aid and other things that are important to consider in disasters. And some of the organizations that joined that effort adopted communities like Coney Island and in Brooklyn, and Canarsie in Brooklyn, and Far Rockaway in Queens. And these were areas that were not getting the kind of help that they needed, but each of these groups were able to set up health fairs or activities for children, partnering with faith communities to offer healing circles for the people who had been affected by disaster, as well as providing other information, for instance, how to clean your home and remove mold that would collect after being inundated with water and so forth. Another example of what we did was after Hurricane Florence in North Carolina, and the community of Lumberton, North Carolina, was particularly hard hit. And they had been hit by Hurricane Matthew a few years before, and they were just beginning to recover from Hurricane Matthew when Florence hit. And through our network, which has members from all over the country, at this point about 24 states and Washington, D.C., and the United States Virgin Islands, everyone was contributing their brain power and the relationships in their networks. And so we would almost always know someone everywhere who was on the ground. And we were able to connect with some pastors there who were serving in a role to welcome disaster-affected families, who had been flooded out of their homes. Some of them were actually staying in the church facilities and receiving meals there, food, shelter, etc. And we organized drives to have toiletries and other items delivered to the church. And I remember when I called the pastor, and she didn't know me from Adam, and I told her who I was and what our organization was all about, and that we our efforts were to try to assist with the mental health needs of disaster affected people. And she just cried, and she just said, "Oh, my prayers have been answered. God sent you to me." And that's what our people are struggling with, mental health. We have to help our people with stress. And so we were able to organize teams of social workers who were members of some of the branches of the National Association of Black Social Workers. And there are several branches in the state of North Carolina. And so a few of them came together and visited that church. They set up sort of a health fair where people came to receive information and resources. And these social workers were just there, to talk with people, to comfort them, to encourage them, to listen to their stories. That's so important. And in one instance, in a group of social workers and medical students from Greenville, North Carolina, Eastern Carolina University there, and their medical school had a number of medical students and psychiatrists and psychologists who joined with the social workers to visit a local church in one of the affected areas, Trenton, North Carolina, which is a very rural part of Eastern North Carolina, which was very hard hit by Hurricane Florence. And so they did some similar things there. And it was a wonderful experience for the medical students to learn that they were not going to be coming there to give medications or to actually do psychiatric treatment, but it was more listening and promoting mental health by their presence and by their interaction and comforting words to the people who are affected. So these are the sorts of things that we do, joining with local community leaders, especially faith leaders who've been especially helpful because they are such a trusted part of the community. And it's through those relationships that we are then able, to engage the community. And we were fortunate to be connected with Hilton after Hurricane Harvey through one of our partners from the National Medical Association. And, we really learned a lot from Hilton, and it was really a mutually beneficial interaction. We were happy to assist him and his family and his neighbors, and also try to follow up to try to link FEMA and HUD in some of the efforts that Hilton was leading. So it's really all about collaboration and engaging people where they are. Each disaster is different. Each community is different in terms of the demographics, the political realities, and so forth. But the key is really customizing to that community and their needs and their desires to something that will address the way that the disaster is affecting them.
Thank you. What really struck me, both about what you just shared and what I heard from you and Mr. Kelly and many people as we're reporting this, is how key it can be to tap those relationships, to figure out ways to collaborate within the community and often outside of the community to try to help after disaster, because it takes so many people to make it work. And so it sounds like being aware, particularly for communities that maybe have more resources, being aware about where are the areas, in our community or near our community that don't have the resources, can help fill some of these gaps, because everybody's going to need help after a disaster. Is that more or less what you both have learned?
I know definitely that's what I've learned. Everyone needs a helping hand during these times, simply because you're sort of off tilt. You're not in your natural or what your comfort zone, so to speak. And many times, you're traveling, uncertain as to what you're traveling back to. And so there's help that is needed all along the way, from the beginning of the natural disaster, throughout the natural disaster, and then post-natural disaster. There's efforts that need to be played out all along that way. And definitely families that are in vulnerable communities, where you have marginalized communities where the moderate income, there's a moderate low income community that have very little, and then they don't know if they're going to get kicked out their apartments, or because they have to get back on their feet. And many times they do get kicked out. I mean, due to all these storms we've had in the city of Port Arthur and surrounding areas, I've seen the population grow to about 300% larger than what it was from when I first came here in 2000. I mean, and Port Arthur is a community of 50,000, 53,000. And yet I grew up on the west end of town, a historically Black community. And we didn't have a lot of homeless issues back when I was growing up here in the 60s and 70s. But now there's pockets of homelessness all over the city of Port Arthur. And the majority of the people that are homeless here are African-American descent, but we have a number of Anglo folks that have become homeless. We have some Vietnamese people that are homeless also. And they're about, maybe I say about 8 to 9% of the population. They came here after the fall of Saigon back in the 1970s, and they settled almost in the middle of Port Arthur. And they're a very quiet community. They stick to themselves, but yet they help each other out. But at the same time, you're having those folks as well fall through the cracks with all these storms. I mean, family members can only help out so many times. And when resources get short and you don't have anywhere to go, and then everybody's packed into one house, the stresses start to weigh in to where it's just not feasible anymore for anyone to maintain those relationships.
Sorry, trying to get my mic turned back on. Thank you. I wanted to throw in another audience question, and Dr. Prim, I'm going to throw this one to you. The question is, as we experience more disasters, is the medical community more aware of PTSD due to these types of traumas? Most people only think of the battlefield when they hear PTSD, so I think a lot goes untreated at best or ignored at worst. What do you think? What are you seeing?
I think there is awareness of post-traumatic stress disorder. I will say that not everyone who goes through a disaster or a trauma will receive a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or experience those sorts of symptoms. People who are most at risk are those who already have a mental disorder of some type, or perhaps have other physical health problems, which might make them more vulnerable. For the most part, after disasters, people are able to recover, fairly well. There may be some acute stress, with some of the sorts of symptoms we were talking about earlier of anxiety and sadness and so forth that is to be expected. And that's very natural and typical. But it is less common for people to actually develop post-traumatic stress disorder, but it does happen, and it's important to be aware of it because it can be, very debilitating. When people have symptoms like, re-experiencing the trauma, having, really terrible nightmares, having mood instability, a lot of sadness, crying. And for some people, they experience numbing where they just don't feel anything. And so you can imagine how that could interfere with relationships and functioning. And I think the thing to remember is that if people are experiencing some of these symptoms of stress or maybe acute stress, if they're still able to function and go about their daily lives, they're pretty much okay. But when it gets to the point that the symptoms are severe enough that they interfere with people performing in their roles as, parents, spouse, in their occupation, if they're still able to work, that's when we get very concerned, and they may need, some sort of mental health care and treatment. But, it is important to be cognizant of post-traumatic stress disorder. It can happen after disasters, but it's more the exception than the rule. So I don't want people to go away thinking that everybody who goes through a disaster ends up with PTSD.
Thank you. I wanted to have you both talk a little bit about because certainly I know that you can speak to this, Dr. Prim, but Mr. Kelly, you probably can too, that there is still in some cases a stigma to getting mental health care. And what we heard as we were reporting is that inevitably after disasters, some survivors say they don't need assistance, even if that support would really help. They're thinking other people need it more, or I don't have time. Sometimes it's, I can't afford it. But what do you think can help reduce the individual barriers to care?
Well, if I may, what we're seeing on the ground, and for me, living in the community where there are a lot of different stresses that bear down on families after natural disasters, is that, number one, economics. Number one, money. They can't afford it. That's what sort of keep a lot of us at bay, because the money that you would spend to go and speak to a professional psychiatrist or therapist or whatever, you could be using to help pay the rent. You could be using to buy the food that's needed to feed your children, or you could be using it to pay the light, gas, and water bill. So many times this is what sort of keep us at bay from seeing mental health professionals. Now, there are some agencies that will bear the cost for you through Health and Human Services, from what I understand, that can assist you with seeing someone, providing you need it. But yet I think the quality of that particular care sometimes is lacking. And so people walk away from that feeling as if, they didn't get anything out of it. But yet, and then also, no one wants to be, I know a couple of people who have seen psychiatrists, and, they don't want to be looked upon as if they're losing their mind, or, have this label on their back in the community, looking at them as if they're crazy, as someone would call them. It's kind of embarrassing if that kind of information get out, that you're seeing a psychiatrist or a therapist or some sort of that, when it comes to your mental health. But we have to help people to get around that and help people to understand. I believe that we all go through something in life. And to be quite honest with you all, I know two people that have taken their own lives, and you never understand why that happened. I know a man who killed his wife and then turned the gun on himself, and they had a double funeral. It's insane, some of the things that happen. And these are some of the people that we see smiling every day, appearing as if everything is fine. And then the next thing you know, they create these, they conduct these acts that you just cannot believe he or she did that.
Thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Prim, what do you think is important to share about both the access issues that may be related to economics, as well as the access issues that are sort of this feeling that, I don't want to seek this help?
Those are very real issues. And, there are some resources that are pro bono that people could get access to. Unfortunately, the kind of mental health services system for the whole country, has been really inadequate. We've got to do better and build it out more. And we know that in rural areas, there are even fewer resources available. But, there are some things like, hotlines and things like that. That's more temporary and crisis in nature. But for actual care over time, that is an issue. And so that's why, to the extent that people can engage in their own self-care, that's important. But identifying resources, and nowadays with COVID-19, telehealth and telepsychiatry resources are more available, and there actually have been some free online services that I have seen be available, and that are geared towards communities of color, just because of, with the racial injustice on top of COVID-19 that we're seeing now. I think there's a greater recognition of the need for reaching out for mental health, especially for people who have felt traumatized by, racial related issues. And I feel that to some extent, the barriers and the stigma associated with mental health in communities of color is reducing somewhat, because people are recognizing that the mental health impact of the sorts of trauma they have gone through is very real. And it can have not only mental health consequences, but physical health consequences as well. And so I believe that the barrier is going down. I noticed that among some of the young people, they're very open, or more open and transparent about seeking mental health services and seeking therapy. Some of them are, getting services, texting with their therapist, and they think it's kind of cool. Getting and just sharing their stories, ventilating, and this is, I think, a trend that I hope will continue, so that people can have their mental health needs met and don't feel like they have to hold these things in and be stoic, kind of having a stiff upper lip, as Hilton was saying, kind of smiling when on the inside, there's a lot of pain. And so the shame that has surrounded mental illness for a long time, it is still there to some extent. And in some cultural groups, it's even more intense, that if you admit to having a mental health concern, you can bring, dishonor, to your family, to your ancestors. But as I said, I hope that that is changing with greater educational resources about mental health and its impact. And with COVID-19, I feel like it has brought more attention to mental health and the importance of paying attention to it now, more than ever. So I hope that, with the greater access to mental health resources, people being able to access therapy right on their phones, that's removing some of the barriers, and it allows people to have more privacy around seeking care, because nobody's going to see them walking into, the community mental health center, or, to be labeled. And I think workplaces are conscious of mental health needs, and schools and universities are as well. The need for mental health therapists in the school system, and counseling centers and colleges and universities. So I think the awareness is increasing, and what the country is going through now with the public health crisis with COVID and the economic crisis associated with it, and the racial injustice crisis, it's really a triple whammy. And it's for once, the country, I think, is coming to terms with the issue of mental health and the importance of paying attention to it, taking it seriously, and reaching out for resources if they are needed.
I just like to add something to that, if I may. I mean, when we talk about stressors and coming to grips and getting a better handle on mental health, there are so many issues that plague our communities that lend a hand on African American communities, people of color communities, being more susceptible to mental health issues due to systemic racism. A lot of the stressors that we have in our communities, I'm just going to put it out there. I grew up in a community where it was drugs. I lost my own mother to domestic violence. My stepdad shot my mother in the temple. We came home, me and my brother found my mother in the bed, dead. And this guy had showed no signs that he was even capable of this. But in our community, we grow up around conditions that really are not, they're really not set up to have a holistic family that's coming up with, with mom, apple pie, white fences, and all this thing. It's really tough communities. And when you live in a tough community and then you're dealing with storms, then you're dealing with police brutality, you're dealing with systemic racism from the federal to the state to the local level. I mean, African-American boys and men, and now our women, the images we have been seeing on television. There's a young man right here in the city of Port Arthur that was tasered. He was tased to death by about 5 policemen during Hurricane Rita. This guy was running around Port Arthur, and he had mental health issues. Everybody knew it. But when we came back, we found out that the police had killed the man. He was stark naked outside, and yet they saw him as a threat. And they had shut the whole town down, but yet they fried this boy. They fried him with tasers. And we got stories told to us that they were even laughing about it. It was almost like they had found a rabid dog and just shot him down or just tased him to death. These are the kind of things, and this is just one story of many. I mean, there's a guy who got killed 2 years ago here in the city of Port Arthur. He was on some type of drug. Officer showed up to the scene. The boy was walking down the street with a machete, okay? He's a block away. The cop aimed the gun from what we're told. He gave the guy a warning. The guy kept walking. Now he's a half a block away. This cop shot this young man 13 times. Even after the body was on the ground, he continued to shoot this guy. These are the kind of threats that we live under. These are the kind of emotional stressors that we deal with on a daily basis, aside from the storms. We can talk about storms, but let's talk about the systemic racism that lend a hand to the mental issues that our women are experiencing, that the men are experiencing, and now our children, and even our grandbabies. I have a grandbaby. My oldest grandchild is 18 years old. The youngest grandchild is a year old. And so now we have to grow up teaching our kids how to deal with the people that are supposed to be serving us. And then we have people who know nothing about our community telling us, oh, we can't believe anything like that happens. Well, it's been happening for years. Ever since the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, we've been marginalized, we've been brutalized, we've been terrorized. And then though you got thousands of people saying they just don't see it. Are you serious? And now we're being sat down on television. We're being smothered to death. 4 or 5 cops on the back of one man on the ground yelling, I can't breathe. And they can't understand how the hell he died. You know, it infuriates me because it's sad what we're going through, and America stands by and watch it happen. They stand by and then they go, oh, that's a shame what happened to those people. We are Americans. We fought for this country. We built this country. We continue to be the subservient labor that served this country. What else do we have to do to get our fair shake in this country? What else do we have to do to get our fair shake during a natural storm because one community keeps flooding every year? Well, hell, that's the same damn community you put us in after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Jim Crow kept us there for another 50, 60 years until fair housing practice came in. Then came, you have these community ownership communities to where they still found ways to discriminate against you from moving into good communities. So therefore, you have to stay in the swamp areas in Mississippi, south of I-10. Go into Louisiana, we still dominate those communities in the swamps in Louisiana. Cross over into Texas, we're still living in marshy, damp areas full of mosquitoes. I grew up in West Port Arthur, literally on the other side of the railroad track. I know what swamps look like. I've had to fight off mosquitoes. I grew up with it. I'm tough, you know, but everybody don't have that same toughness. But don't think I don't harbor the frustration and the anger of those people who don't have that toughness, who don't have the ability to pick themselves up by bootstraps that they haven't even had the opportunity to work to achieve to get. So, you know, when you talk about mental stressors, there's so many, it's unimaginable right now to me. And when a hurricane comes, it don't even bother me. Yes, my wife cries. I don't worry about the brick and mortar. I worry about getting home safe. Because when we go to one community from another, all it takes is one misstep in those wooded areas with Sheriff Benton or whatever sheriff of the town may be, and your kids could end up dead. So you have to learn to stay in one area as you travel. And even if somebody does have a mishap to where they have a stressful moment or a mental breakdown, you're liable to lose your life. Most times when the cops show up for us, it's not, well, you could tell the guy, he's butt naked, man, with one shoe on. Well, shoot him. That's what usually happens. So there are so many stresses that plague our community. Aside from a storm, I don't even worry about a storm anymore. I've ran from so many storms to where it doesn't bother me anymore. I stay strong for my family. And if the damn house is gone, it's gone. But we still have life. I was in the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 in the Bay Area in West Oakland. I saw the cypress structure fall. I helped to pull bodies off of that bridge. I've seen it, and that was in West Oakland, predominantly Black community, but now it's been regentrified. They have townhouses there now. Thank you, Silicon Valley. And those people were forced out and living under bridges. But yet, this is what we live under. So hurricanes don't really bother me so much anymore. But yet, it is a bother for many people because it destroys homes, it destroys property, and many people don't have the resources to get back into a home or to rebuild their home. And then when FEMA pops up on the scene, the contractor that you done hired to come out to give you a bid, like they ask you to do, he'd tell you, well, you got around $40,000 worth of damage, and for me to repair that roof, you're looking at 40 grand. Wow. Well, FEMA comes, well, the only thing we could give you, we only see maybe $20,000 worth of damage. Here's a check. Good luck. So mental stressors, hurricane stressors, we got them all. But what I try to tell a lot of young people, you know, this is the hand we were dealt, and we are fighting for better days, and one day those days will come. But till then, you got to be tough. You got to be tough, because if you're waiting for the white horse, damn it, it ain't coming.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for sharing that. And, you know, I want to ask a question that is sort of riffs off of that to both of you, which is that I know that there are some journalists in the audience thinking about, you know, how do I cover disasters in a way that takes all this into account? What do you think is important? And I would say maybe keep it to 2 points, because I want to make sure we can get to a couple more questions, including audience questions, before we have to finish up. What do you think are the key things for journalists to keep in mind as they're covering the aftermath of disasters, in terms of communities that are particularly impacted? Because I think the way this gets covered can have a big impact on then, you know, what happens down the road.
Well,
Go ahead, Hilton.
okay, well, I would just say this. Be sensitive. Be caring when you go into those communities. I understand you can't get too involved, but just try to be understanding of the plight that they're dealing with. You know, just talk to them, get their stories, and also do it in a timely fashion. I mean, I've had a lot of reporters come to me immediately after storm. As a matter of fact, I was on to Santita Jackson's radio show. I was on Democracy Now! I understand the importance of media. I understand the importance of telling the story, but you have that regular mom out there and that dad with 4 or 5 kids who don't get it. And I've been able to get some people involved with talking to the media, because I understand that's what helped to put the word out about what you're going through. So it's critically important. But understand the fact, when you're dealing with layman people that just don't get it, don't understand the whole media thing and how that could come back to enhance your community or your environment, just be a little caring and understanding of that, and give them time.
Thank you. Dr. What would you say?
Yeah, I agree with what Hilton said. And I think that it's important not to be superficial just about the disaster itself and the damage that caused. I think understanding some of the underpinnings, because, you know, as Hilton was saying, sometimes the environment and the situation in which people were living even before the disaster hit has made them even more vulnerable to, you know, the devastation and, you know, the displacement and, you know, removal from their communities. And so the domino effect, you know, the reverberations of the disaster, it plays out, you know, and understanding what those layers are. And that might require digging a bit into the history of that place and what has happened before. So, you know, you're really needing to cover not just the disaster itself, but also the underpinnings. So you kind of have to be prepared to kind of lift that veil and look underneath at some of the other issues. And people in those communities, they will tell you, they have the local knowledge to help you truly understand you know, the environment, the ecosystem, if you will, and what's going on that has led to their particular situation, particularly if there's a disparity in how their needs are being met. And hopefully journalists will gravitate towards those communities that don't get the media attention. That's one of the things that we often worry about with the All Healers Mental Health Alliance, is that, you know, for instance, with Lake Charles and Hurricane Laura, you know, we don't really see the cameras there anymore. And so they're suffering, they're still suffering, but that's kind of hidden. And so I would say don't be so quick to leave. Don't forget about these communities. I think keeping, you know, the publicity of your writing, your journalism is so critical to the lifeline for those communities, because once there's no more writing and no more cameras, there's no more attention, no more resources. I mean, the All Healers Mental Health Alliance, through its volunteer efforts, we do what we can in mobilizing local leaders. But I guess that's my main point.
I'm on my way back to Lake Charles tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. There are some people out there just north of I-10, And those are the low-income communities, severely low-income, elderly women, women with children, and they still have trees on their homes. They still have holes in the roof. And in some spots, they still don't have any electricity. And so what I've done, we put together a brigade of 6 African-American men from here in the city of Port Arthur. We're going out there, this is about my 6th time going out there to lend a hand. And if anyone would like to see that, you could go on my Facebook account and see video, pictures of the work that we're doing. It's Hilton Kelly on Facebook. It's open to the public. Just check it out. And www.cidainc.org, cedainc.org is our website. You can also go there and see videos and pictures. And so there's a lot of need here. I mean, one reason why I feel an obligation to help our neighbors is because when we got hit by Hurricane Rita, when we got hit by Ike, people came to us. I mean, so I have to be an ambassador for my community to give back to others and represent us. And I just feel an obligation to do that. And I love to help others. So this is another reason why I do it, because I know I want someone to help me, and someone has helped me in my time of need. So I have to pay that back. And so I think it's important that, yeah, once the media lights go off, keep in mind that most of the time the assistance goes away. And many times this is when your real community activists kick in, because we already know there's going to be people that have fallen through the cracks that need somebody to reach in those cracks and pull them back up.
Thank you. I want to, I know we're a little past time, but we got started late. So I want to ask you, both of you, one more question. This one comes from the audience. And I think this is a good way to end. The question is, I've read that when disaster survivors are able to pull together as a community to help each other survive and rebuild, this improves mental health outcomes. Is this true? If so, how can we support this communal process after a disaster?
That is true. And it is said that the 5 main things that maximize mental health after a disaster are restoring a sense of calm, restoring a sense of safety, individual and collective efficacy working together, maintaining connectedness, and maintaining hope. And so I think that all communities could adopt this, so that they could understand that, work together with their faith leaders and other community leaders, people like Hilton Kelly, and to come together in times of disaster and make sure that, you know, all segments of the community are taken care of, especially the ones that tend to be neglected and overlooked. And so if people were just conscious and intentional and deliberate about that, and planning in advance, you know, being prepared for these things and having a plan, working with that community, of course, always being inclusive of their voices and their desires. But I think, you know, all of our communities need to be thinking that way, being very proactive and planful. Each community should have a public health disaster type of unit. People need to, you know, connect with those officials and make the sort of plans, and also encourage young people to undergo CERT training, community emergency response teams, so they can learn more about disasters. You know, we need to have more of our young people knowledgeable about that, and becoming disaster professionals of all races and ethnic backgrounds, so that communities will not be overlooked.
Yeah, I love that question. And in thinking about it, I realized that, you know, I think that's what sort of kept me balanced, was the fact that I always sort of get involved. When I realized there's nothing I could do for my own personal situation, you know, I just lend a hand to others. As a matter of fact, case in point, when we were inundated with water here in my home, we had 3 feet of water and we couldn't really touch anything because the mold was so bad, and FEMA hadn't came by to assess the damage. And there was a huge 18-wheeler, 2 18-wheelers had pulled up at the Steve Jackson Center here in the city of Port Arthur. Steve Jackson is a former basketball player. I think he played with the this Bay Area team, but in either case, Steve Jackson is from here, and he had some trucks come in. They were offloading grocery and water and other amenities that people needed. And so somebody told me that they needed a hand. I went around there, said hello to Steve and his mom and Mrs. Jackson and whatnot, and I just started helping to offload. And I found that that sort of took my mind off of my own issues, because at the time I couldn't deal with them anyway. And then after that, I encouraged my wife to do the same thing. I said, well, why don't you, since we're here at the restaurant, why don't you go ahead and just cook a big gumbo? And so as a matter of fact, she pitched in and she did a great gumbo. And before you know it, I say, do one more pot. And before you know it, she was smiling again, talking with her girlfriends and talking about the house and what a mess it was. And I kept telling them, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be fine. We'll rebuild. So it's good to keep yourself, I think, occupied and lend a hand to someone else. I think the find is that your problems are not as bad as many others.
Can you all hear me? I lost power for a second, not related to a disaster, but I'm back on. Thank you both so much for sharing your experiences. I knew this was going to be an important conversation, and I'm just blown away by what you both shared. I really appreciate you being part of this. And I'm sorry to the audience that we had technical difficulties and we're not able to get Dr. Redlander on, but this was a great conversation. I hope you're able to learn some things that can help you in your community and that you can share. And I know that as we share the recording, which you can then share with other people, we'll be sharing links too. So thank you both so much, Dr. Prim and Mr. Kelly. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. Great question.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye. You too.